There are moments in geopolitics when the most dangerous message is not delivered by a missile launch or a formal declaration of war. It is delivered by timing, by sequence, by two signals placed next to each other so carefully that anyone still pretending not to understand is making a choice, not an error. That is what happened here. On the same day, Turkey's foreign ministry published an official communiqué calling Benjamin Netanyahu the Hitler of our times. Turkey also put its most destructive thermobaric bomb on display. Not a leak, not a rumor, not a think tank paper, an official diplomatic document on one side and an official military signal on the other. That combination is the story. The bomb matters. Of course it matters. But the real story is not that Turkey has a heavy thermobaric weapon. The real story is that Ankara chose this exact moment to make military capability and diplomatic language speak together. One hand published moral indictment, the other hand displayed physical force. Put those two acts together, and the message becomes very hard to miss. Turkey is no longer trying merely to condemn Israel. Turkey is trying to alter the regional calculation around Israel. That is a much bigger thing. A thermobaric weapon is not just another bomb. It is a weapon designed to turn enclosed space into death. First, a fuel cloud spreads through the target area. Then the cloud ignites, the blast wave is brutal, but the real horror is what follows. Heat pressure, oxygen consumed, internal collapse, lungs fail. Bodies are crushed and burned in spaces that ordinary explosives might only damage. When Turkish officials emphasize that this weapon can reach reinforced underground positions, they are not sharing a technical curiosity. They are naming a target category without naming the target. That detail matters because in statecraft, technical description often functions as strategic address. And now place that beside the communiqué, Turkey did not issue a vague criticism. It did not release another generic statement about restraint or concern. It used one of the most absolute comparisons available in modern political language. It placed Netanyahu in the Hitler category under official letterhead. That is not routine diplomatic outrage. That is escalation in institutional form. It tells every capital in the region and every ministry in Europe and Washington that Ankara has decided normal language is no longer sufficient. Once a state crosses that line, the question stops being whether it is angry. The question becomes what it is preparing the ground to justify. That is the right way to read this moment. A lot of people will make the mistake of reading this as a simple threat. Turkey shows a big bomb. Turkey insults Netanyahu. Turkey is angry that reading is too shallow. The deeper structure is that Turkey is constructing deterrence by demonstration. It is trying to create a new mental map in the region before firing a shot. It wants Israel, Washington, Tehran, the Gulf monarchies, and the broader Sunni world to look at the same sequence and reach the same conclusion. Ankara has decided that Gaza and the widening regional war are no longer issues on which it will remain rhetorically loud but strategically secondary. That is the shift. Turkey has been moving toward this role for years. Under Erdogan, Ankara has tried to position itself as more than a nation-state protecting narrow borders. It has tried to become the political center of gravity for a much larger constituency: Sunni outrage, anti-Israeli anger, frustration with Arab hostility, and the vacuum created by a Western order that speaks the language of law but applies it selectively. When Egypt hesitates, when Jordan calibrates, when Saudi Arabia balances, Turkey sees an opening. And Turkey almost never ignores a vacuum. That is why this event cannot be reduced to a bomb unveiling. The bomb is the visible edge of a larger claim. Turkey is telling the region that it is prepared to become the actor willing to say publicly what others say privately, and to show military instruments while others issue statements of concern. It is not simply trying to frighten Israel. It is trying to outbid the entire regional field for political relevance. Look at the audiences one by one, and the logic becomes clearer. The signal is obvious. Ankara wants Israeli planners to understand that if the war keeps widening, Turkey possesses tools built for exactly the kind of hardened infrastructure and buried command environments that modern regional warfare relies on. Whether Turkey intends to use them tomorrow is beside the point. Deterrence begins long before use. It begins when the other side has to include the possibility in its calculations. For the United States, the signal is more uncomfortable. Turkey is a NATO member, not a fringe actor, not a rogue militia, not a client state that can be ignored. A NATO member with the alliance's second largest army has now paired an official moral denunciation of Israel's leader with an official demonstration of bunker-killing firepower. Washington cannot treat that as noise. If it does, it is admitting that the alliance can no longer impose a coherent political language on one of its most strategically placed members. For Iran, the signal is double. Ankara is not Tehran's ally. They compete across Syria, Iraq, and the Caucasus. So when Turkey highlights a weapon capable of attacking deep fortified positions, Tehran cannot miss the subtext either. The message is not only we can threaten Israel, it is also do not mistake our anti-Israel posture for strategic dependency on you. Turkey wants the Muslim street without becoming an Iranian appendage. It wants leadership, not alignment. For the Arab world, the message may be the most potent of all. Turkey is saying, while others manage optics, we are willing to combine accusation, law, and force into one coherent posture. That matters because moral vacuums in the Middle East do not stay empty. If traditional Arab powers appear too cautious, while Gaza burns and the regional war expands, the state that most convincingly occupies the emotional and political space left behind gains enormous influence. Ankara understands that perfectly. This is why the Western silence matters. When Western press and institutions treat this as a side story, they are not making it less real. They are making themselves slower to understand what kind of strategic environment is forming. Because what is forming is not a sudden Turkish outburst, it is the emergence of a new pressure geometry in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the wider Middle East, Israel is no longer dealing only with Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and the diplomatic fallout of Gaza. It is increasingly dealing with a major regional military power that wants the conflict to reorder leadership in the Muslim world. That changes the board. The easy question is whether Turkey intends to use this bomb. The harder and far more important question is whether Turkey has already succeeded without using it. In many cases, that is how power works. The weapon that never leaves the hangar can still change events if it enters the enemy's planning model strongly enough. The communiqué and the bomb were released together because Ankara understands something very old and very important. When rhetoric and capability are displayed in the same frame, they produce political force greater than either could alone. Now let me push this one level deeper. The real danger here is not immediate war between Turkey and Israel tomorrow morning. The real danger is a ladder. Once a state publicly elevates its language this far, once it makes the moral indictment absolute and places military capability beside it, it has less room to retreat without cost. That is true for Turkey, but it is also true for Israel. If Israel ignores the signal completely, Ankara's credibility suffers, which creates pressure for Turkey to do something more visible. Next time, if Israel responds with contempt or further escalation, Turkish leadership comes under stronger domestic and regional pressure to prove that its words were not theater. If Washington tries to dampen the crisis quietly, without addressing the underlying Gaza catastrophe, it may buy time but not solve the structural problem, because the emotional and political fuel driving Ankara's move remains in place. This is what I mean by a ladder. Every rung narrows the range of low-cost exits, and the Gaza factor sits underneath all of it. Any serious reading of Turkey's move has to confront the fact that Gaza is not background scenery in this story. It is the energy source. Turkey's escalation is not happening in abstraction. It is happening after months of destruction, mass death, devastated hospitals, starvation accusations, international criminal court action, and the visible collapse of the claim that ordinary diplomatic language is restraining events. In that environment, a state like Turkey can argue to the region that conventional condemnation has failed, and only harder signals now have value. You do not have to endorse Ankara's agenda to understand the power of that argument. and this is where the Western response has been, especially weak. Too much of it still treats military signaling by allies and quasi-allies as manageable noise, while treating every comparable move by adversaries as system shaking. But strategic reality does not care about our preferred categories. A 1-ton thermobaric bomb displayed by a NATO member on the same day its foreign ministry compares Israel's leader to Hitler is not a communications accident. It is not a side anecdote. It is the kind of event analysts are supposed to stop and stare at because it reveals intention before intention becomes action. The most revealing question is not, will Turkey strike? It is, what future is Ankara preparing itself to be relevant in? There are only a few possibilities. If the Gaza war grinds on and Israel widens operations further into Lebanon or beyond, Turkey wants to already be positioned as the state that warned early, spoke clearly, and possessed the means to matter. If regional diplomacy collapses further, Turkey wants to inherit the leadership vacuum. If NATO fractures more openly over Middle East strategy, Turkey wants to prove that alliance membership does not erase its independent posture. And if the Muslim world moves toward a prolonged contest over who truly represents resistance to Israeli power, Turkey wants to be standing at the front of that argument, not somewhere in the second row. That is why this matters so much. The bomb is not just a bomb, it is a credential. It tells the region that Ankara is not arriving empty-handed. It tells Washington that Turkey cannot be managed solely through alliance etiquette. It tells Israel that future escalation may no longer be contained inside the familiar set of actors. And it tells every government still hoping this war can be discussed, as though it remains geographically narrow, that the war's political geography has already expanded far beyond Gaza. In moments like this, I always come back to a simple rule. When a state shows you the weapon, the language, and the timing all at once, believe the structure, not the excuses offered afterward. Turkey has shown the region a bunker-killing thermobaric bomb. Turkey has used official state language that removes Netanyahu from normal diplomatic treatment. Turkey has done both in the same breath. That is not an emotional spasm, that is positioning. And the larger judgment is this: the Middle East is entering a phase in which regional powers are no longer waiting for Washington, Brussels, or the old Arab order to define the outer limits of action. They are beginning to define those limits themselves. Turkey is telling you that with firepower, with symbolism, and with timing, the most dangerous thing about this moment is not that a bomb was unveiled. It is that a new regional claim to leadership was just spoken in the language of war.